Hello. In this lecture, we are going to talk about Foucault, born in 1926 and died in 1984. Foucault wrote many important works. Some of them are History of Madness in Classical Age, The Archaeology of Knowledge, The Birth of the Clinic, Discipline and Punish, The Order of Things. The Discipline and Punish is also subtitled The Birth of the Prism. Let us begin by understanding his idea of knowledge. Foucault was not interested in the way knowledge in different subject areas accumulated throughout history and changed during different historical periods, but in the mechanisms by which this happened. In particular, he was interested in the way in which one way of looking at the world changed into another. He considered that history was very much connected with the nature of human thought at a specific period. According to Foucault, each historical period was characterized by a set of intellectual rules that helped to decide what would be regarded as valid knowledge at that time. He called these set of intellectual rules epistemes. Foucault thought that the ideology that was prevalent during a period in history greatly affected the lives of people and determined the way in which they thought about the world. Foucault tended to suggest that he did not want to change the way in which people thought about their surroundings, but to encourage them to think about the processes in society that affected them. He was sometimes described as a post-structuralist, but he preferred to avoid being associated with a particular school of thought. However, he disagreed with the structuralists on two counts. Firstly, he did not think that there were definite underlying structures that could explain the human condition. And secondly, he thought that it was impossible to step outside of discourse and survey the situation objectively. In his book, The Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault rejects the traditional historian's tendency to read straightforward narratives of progress in the historical record. According to him, for many years now, historians have preferred to turn their attention to long periods, as if beneath shifts and changes of political events, they were trying to reveal the stable, almost indestructible system of checks and balances, the irreversible processes, the constant readjustments, the underlying tendencies that gather force and are then suddenly reversed after centuries of continuity, the moments of accumulation and slow saturation, the great, silent, motionless basis that traditional history has covered with a thick layer of events. These are the words of Foucault himself. By contrast, he argues that one should seek to reconstitute not large periods or centuries, but the phenomena of rupture or discontinuity. The problem is no longer one of tradition, of tracing a line, but one of division and of limits. Instead of presenting a monolithic version of a given period, Foucault argues that we must reveal how any given periods reveal several paths, several forms of connection, several hierarchies of importance, several networks of determination, several teleologies. Foucault adopts the term archaeology to designate a historical period, and he articulates what he means by the term by specifying how his method differs from both traditional history, particularly history of ideas. Archaeology is the term Foucault used in the 1960s to describe his approach to writing history. Archaeology is about examining the discursive traces and orders left by the past in order to write a history of the present. In other words, archaeology is about looking at history as a way of understanding the processes that have led to what we are today. Foucault remarks on the difference between archaeology and genealogy. Of course, these differences that he enumerates are generally vague and confusing. The tools Foucault uses to practice both methods are to all purposes the same. But if archaeology addresses a level at which difference and similarities are determined, a level where things are simply organized to produce manageable forms of knowledge, the stakes are much higher for genealogy. Genealogy deals with the same substrata of knowledge and culture, but Foucault described it as a level where the grounds of the true and the false come to be distinguished through mechanisms of power. Let us now turn our attention to Foucault's understanding of madness. Foucault looks at the history of medicine and mental illness and the discourses that surround them. Madness, for example, has not always been a medical condition. Foucault argues that the cure for leprosy in the medieval Europe left the buildings used to confine lepers later empty. These circumstances provided a place to put mad people out of. This grew asylums and therefore psychiatrists, and over time madness became described as mental illness. The mad before this were not ill, they were possessed by spirits or seen as village idiots. In his book Madness and Civilization, Foucault states the definition of the other and why it is important for the other to exist. To him, madness is the other of the knowledge. The other is both subject and object of the abnormalities that are perceived to threaten modern civil societies. The other is the standard for normality. Foucault seeks throughout his work to make sense of how our contemporary society is structured differently from the society that preceded us. He has been particularly influential precisely because he tends to overturn accepted wisdom, illustrating the dangers that are inherent in those Enlightenment reforms that were designed to correct the barbarity of previous periods. As Foucault illustrates, each process of modernization entails disturbing effects with regard to the power of the individual and the control of government. His most influential work, Discipline and Punish, subtitled The Birth of the Prison, paints a picture of contemporary society that resembles George Orwell's novel in 1984. He explores the ways that government has claimed ever greater control over and enforcement of ever more private aspects of our lives. In particular, Foucault explores the transition from what he calls a culture of spectacle to a carceral culture. In the culture of spectacle, punishment was effected on the body in public displays of torture, dismemberment, and obliteration. But in the carceral culture, punishment and discipline became internalized and directed when necessary to the rehabilitation of social subjects. Jeremy Bentham's 19th century prison reforms provide Foucault with a representative model for what happens to society in the 19th century. Bentham argued in his Panopticon the perfect prison which would be structured in such a way that cells would be open to central tower. In this model, individuals in the cells do not interact with each other and are constantly confronted by the panoptic tower, the all-seeing tower. They cannot see when there is a person in the tower. They must believe that they could be watched at any moment. Bentham saw this prison reform as a model for how society should function. To maintain order in a democratic and capitalist society, the populace needs to believe that any person could be watched over at any time. In time, such a structure would ensure that the people would soon internalize the panoptic tower and police themselves. By carceral culture, Foucault refers to a culture in which the panoptic model of surveillance has been diffused as a principle of social organization, affecting such disparate things as the university classroom. As Foucault puts it, the Panopticon is polyvalent in its applications. It serves to reform prisoners, but also to treat patients, to instruct school children, to confine the insane, to supervise workers, to put beggars and idlers to work. It is a type of location of bodies in space, of distribution of individuals in relation to one another, of hierarchical organization, of disposition of centers and channels of power, of definition of the instruments and modes of intervention of power, which can be implemented in hospitals, workshops, schools, and prisons. Whenever one is dealing with the multiplicity of individuals on whom a task on a particular form of behavior must be imposed, the panoptic schema may be used. Let us now turn our attention to Foucault's understanding of power. Foucault's understanding of power changes between his early work on institutions and his later works on sexuality and governmentality. In the early work, Foucault sometimes gives a sense that power somehow inheres in institutions themselves rather than in the individuals that make those institutions function. Of course, what Foucault explores in those books is how the creation of modern disciplines, with their principles of order and control, tends to disindividualize power, making it seem as if power inheres in the prison, in the school, in the factory, and so on. The Panopticon becomes Foucault's model for the way other institutions function. The Panopticon is an important mechanism for it automatizes and disindividualizes power. Power has its principle not so much in a person as in a certain concerted distribution of bodies, surfaces, lights, and gases, in an arrangement whose internal mechanisms produce the relation in which individuals are caught up. Bentham's goal was to create an architectural idea that ultimately could function on its own. It did not matter who exactly operated the machine. The idea of discipline itself simply functions as an abstraction of the idea of power from any individual. According to Foucault, discipline may be identified neither with an institution nor with an apparatus. It is a type of power, a modality for its exercise, comprising a whole set of instruments, techniques, procedures, levels of applications, and targets. Bureaucracies, like disciplines, contribute to the process of disindividuation since they promote the facelessness of the bureaucrat and tend to continue functioning even after major revolutions. The effect of this tendency to disindividualize power is the perception that power resides in the machine itself rather than in the operator. For this reason, one can finish reading Foucault's Discipline and Punish with the paranoid feeling that we are powerless before such an effective and diffuse form of social control. Foucault makes clear in his later work, however, that power ultimately inheres in individuals, including those who are watched or punished. It is true that contemporary forms of disciplinary organization allow ever large number of people to be controlled by ever smaller number of specialists. However, as Foucault explains in The Subject and Power, something called power, which is assumed to exist universally in a concentrated or diffused form, does not exist. Power exists only when it is put into action. Foucault therefore makes clear that in itself, power is not a renunciation of freedom, transference of rights, the power of each and all delegated to a few. Indeed, power is not the same as violence because the opposite pole of violence can only be passivity. By contrast, a power relationship can only be articulated on the basis of two elements, which are each indispensable if it is really to be a power relationship. That the other be thoroughly recognized and maintained to the very end as a person who acts, and that faced with the relationship of power, a whole field of responses, reactions, results, and possible inventions may open up. Power always entails a set of actions performed upon another person's actions and reactions. Although violence may be part of some power relationships, in itself the exercise of power is not violence. It is always a way of acting upon an acting subject or acting subjects by virtue of their acting or becoming capable of action. Foucault therefore turns in his later work to the concept of government in order to explain how power functions. Basically, power is less a confrontation between two adversaries or the linking of one to the other than a question of government. This word must be allowed the very broad meaning which it had in the 16th century. Government did not refer only to political structures or to the management of states. Rather, it designated the way in which the conduct of individuals or of groups might be directed. The government of children, of communities, of families, or of the sick. It did not only cover the legitimately constituted forms of political or economic subjection, but also modes of action more or less considered and calculated, which were destined to act upon the possibilities of action of other people. To govern in this sense is to structure the possible field of action of others. The relationship proper to power would not therefore be sought on the side of violence or of struggle, nor on that of voluntary linking, but rather in the area of the singular mode of action, neither warlike nor juridical, which is the government. The turn to this concept of government allowed Foucault to include a new element to his understanding of power, namely freedom. In his own words, power is exercised only over free subjects, and only insofar as they are free. Conversely, slavery is not a power relationship when men are in chains. Indeed, at the very heart of power relationship are the recalcitrance of the will and the intransigence of freedom. To conclude, Foucault claimed that his interest was to create a history of different modes by which in our culture human beings are made subjects. By this he meant the way in which human beings are made the subjects of objectifying study and practices through knowledge, social norms, and sexuality. Thus he applied his archaeological methods to sexuality, insanity, history, and punishment. Just prior to his death, Concern for the Self, the third of his projected 5-volume history of sexuality, was published in France. The first 2 volumes, The Will to Know and The Use of Pleasure, explored the relation between morality and sexuality. Concern for the Self addresses the oppression of women by men. In these studies, as in his Discipline and Punish, he makes reference to the rise of penal institutions. Foucault isolated the institutions that are images of the episteme of modernity. His conclusion was that modernity is marked not by liberalization and freedom, but by the repression of sexuality and the totalitarianism of the norm in mass culture. Foucault's work continues to have significance for historical, literary, and philosophical study. In his later years, Foucault wrote and spoke extensively on varying topics ranging from language to the relations of knowledge and power. In the span of a short career, Foucault had considerable impact on the intellectual world. Yet, given the complexity, subtlety, and eclecticism of his style, the full impact of his work has yet to be realized. Thank you very much.